What's this winged character doing halfway up a ladder? How does it interact with other cultures? And what's love got to do with it? Okay, to start with then, the piece itself. This is a lekithos, and it's actually got an acorn designed to it, and it dates to around the turn of the 4th century BC, so sort of 400 to 380 BC. And what you can see on this are two figures. So you've got what looks like a woman on one side, and then you've got that winged character up a ladder. Now you might think to yourself, you've got wings, why do you need a ladder exactly? Well, this was because it related to a particular festival for women. Specifically, it seems in ancient Athens. This was the Adonia. The winged character is Eros, and as you may well know, he was associated strongly with Aphrodite. And so straight away we have this link, which is actually really quite important, because it relates to a myth of Aphrodite and one of her lovers, an individual called Adonis. Adonis, unfortunately, had his life cut short whilst out hunting a boar, and she mourned him. She mourned him quite a bit, in fact. And there was a festival at Athens called the Adonia. And this seems quite an interesting festival because, to start with, it doesn't seem to have been state-sponsored or regulated. That is to say, it was an all-woman festival. It seems to be predominantly a women-only, as it were, festival. But it seems to have been one which the women sort of got on with and did themselves. And this involved a ladder. The ladder was really important here because it was used to get to the rooftops, and the women would go on the rooftops and they'd sprinkle seeds onto little broken pieces of pottery. And the idea was that they'd grow seedlings, but the seedlings weren't there to grow into full-blown gardens, as it were. The whole idea actually was that they'd wither and die, because that's ultimately what happened to Adonis. And so the Adonia was a sort of funeral-style festival, as it were, for women in ancient Athens, and women, by the way, of any class and any status. And it's argued as mimicking their roles and their responsibilities in the funeral process, because they would be involved in a number of key elements or key stages of that process, such as laying out of the body, dressing the body, doing stuff like that, but also mourning. And that's a really key part of the whole festival, because there's lots of noise associated to this. Aristophanes talks about how noisy they were. There's Menander writing around 100 years later, and he also talks about the sort of revelry that went on. So it seems to have been quite a spontaneously loud, noisy event, and it probably involved drinking as well. All of that drinking and singing and dancing on rooftops. I know, recipe for disaster. In any case, here's another vase. This one's slightly later. This dates to around 360 BC. This is a water vessel or hydra. And on it, there is Eros. You can see he's sort of hanging around up there. And you can see a woman, and it looks like she's actually sprinkling or perhaps collecting some seeds on the ladder as either she's ascending or descending from the rooftop. So what's this got to do with other cultures? Well, we can actually think about this vessel itself, because this vessel, though made in Attica, was found in Cyrene, which was a colony in what is modern-day Libya. But this also seems to have referenced a myth or practice that occurred in Mesopotamia, because this activity was linked to a couple of other myths, or there are elements of it found in Mesopotamian myths. And you have to remember that Aphrodite's evolved. And of course, Aphrodite does have an association with Mesopotamia in the form of Ishtar, Astarte, those kind of deities. For example, take the case of Tammuz, who in some myths was a shepherd, who was also a consort of Inanna, a goddess, deity who is associated with Aphrodite. And he too met his end whilst hunting a boar. Now, it's incredibly important, and I've said this in a few videos before, that we appreciate just how influenced Greek worship was by other mythologies. Ancient Greek worship, ancient Greek myth, this was not a segregated thing by any standards. This was something that was influenced by other cultures, and this is a really good example of that. One final thing to consider is the dating of all of this. Now, this is really quite a difficult thing to date. The earliest concrete reference we have dates to around the 420s BC and at Athens. It doesn't seem that this was practiced anywhere else in this form. And we find a reference to it, fun enough, in a play by Aristophanes, Lysistrata. You may have heard of it, and he talks about the boisterousness of the women on the rooftops having climbed their ladders. Now, I should also mention that there is a reference to this in one of the fragments by Sappho, who was a poet of the 6th century BC, where she talks about women sort of beating their chests and mourning about Adonis. But whether or not that actually manifested in this type of event, we just don't know. But of course, there is that reference to it, so we have to bear that in mind as well.